concur that what is happening in Palestine is genocide.
Right, Israel, which had been doing terrible crimes before the war in Gaza, right? I mean, much before the war in Gaza. But very often, more often than not, it's simply, a way of silencing people, in my view, call them anti-Semite because they criticize Israel.
They cry for bread, they get bombs. They reach out for water and only find rubble. Gazans are not dying by accident. They're being erased on purpose. This is deliberate. It is not defense. This certainly is not a war. It is the annihilation of an entire people. And the world is watching it happen. Merciless and in real time. Today we decode what constitutes genocide, and does what Israel is doing in Gaza fall under genocide or not? Hello and welcome. You're watching Statecraft with me, Geeta Moon. From hospitals reduced to ash to children buried under rubble, to starving families being chased by drones, what Israel has been doing in Gaza since October 2023 has crossed every legal and moral threshold. It no longer is just retaliation against the Hamas. It is the annihilation of an entire people. Top genocide scholars now are unanimous. Even those who were once cautious now concur that what's happening in Gaza Strip is indeed genocide. It is not just disproportionate violence that one is witnessing, it's the annihilation of an entire people. Can global silence be excused for ignorance? Genocide isn't an event, it's a process. That's the chilling truth, now voiced by leading experts in the field, scholars who have studied Rwanda, Bosnia, Armenia, and the Holocaust. In Gaza, that process has matured into full form. The mass killing of civilians, the starvation of an entire population, demolition of homes, hospitals, schools, mosques, and cultural centers, the dehumanizing rhetoric, the generational trauma, it's all there, the hallmarks, the patterns, the intent. And this isn't speculation, this is the studied conclusion of several genocide scholars. India Today Global spoke to two of them.
In genocide studies, we refer to genocide as a process, not an event. So those of us who are looking at what's going on are not talking about just today. We are looking at systematic persecution and discrimination for a very lengthy period of time that took place well before the 7th of October 2023. And all of that is part of it. So the reason that we talk about genocide as a process is because you can't just suddenly start killing people out of nowhere. It's what genocidal regimes need to do is create circumstances where the destruction of a minority group, of the targeted group, is seen as acceptable to the majority population, and therefore the perpetrators are allowed to carry it out. Where essentially the majority population becomes bystanders, they become complicit in what is going on, and they essentially permit that to go ahead. And so that's why we talk about it as a process, because what that process involves is often, it can be many years or many months of time where that targeted group is dehumanized, they are discriminated against, and they are gradually removed from society in different ways by, for example, being prohibited from entering particular areas or prohibited from working in particular professions, and prohibited from accessing education, prohibited from participating in public life such as politics. And so by doing this group eventually becomes alienated and perceived by the majority group as less than human. And so by the time it reaches the point where the perpetrator regime can carry out serious physical harm, that becomes acceptable to the majority population. In the International Association of Genocide Scholars, we have hundreds of members worldwide who come from different disciplines, and are essentially all experts in some way in genocide studies. And as far as I am aware at this point, many people, and the majority of opinions that I'm aware of, concur that what is happening in Palestine is genocide. And those who disagree they are quite in the minority at the moment. And from my awareness, they are Israeli-based scholars, and those scholars declare that there is no evidence of intent. All other scholars from other areas of the world, including Jewish scholars who are based outside of Israel, all concur that genocide is taking place.
Dr. Lederman, the fact that there has been growing consensus on this one issue. Now, I also interviewed President of the International Association for Genocide Scholars, Melanie O'Brien, and she said that there's growing consensus, mostly Jews, as also other scholars from across the world have come together calling this a genocide. Reluctance on some of the scholars who are based out of Israel, and there are some exceptions, you included. But is there growing consensus amongst genocide scholars that this is maybe one of the most horrific crimes that we are seeing against humanity?
So that's my sense too, that there is quite a consensus among genocide scholars about this question. Now, it's very hard to assess that, in any kind of certainty, because after all, there are many different genocide scholars, and some are more involved in the situation and speak about it and write about it, and some are less. But to the extent that one can assess that, that's my sense as well, that, basically almost any genocide scholar that I saw or I heard said, well, at that point, I think it's genocide. And that has been roughly the case, I would say, since the second half of 2024. Now, I do need to clarify that there are actually two different discourses going on here, because when genocide scholars speak, usually naturally, when people speak about genocide, they think in the legal terms, right? There is a genocide convention, a UN Genocide Convention, that defines the term genocide, and it's a specific legal definition. And that's one discourse that many are engaged in, whether it rises to the very high bar, it should be said, of the legal definition of genocide. But genocide scholars, for a long time, for decades, have been engaged in a discourse that is critical of the legal definition, because it's a very narrow definition, and because it's originated partly in the political interest of the states that formulated it. So we've been critical of this definition. So I would say, I think at this point, probably for the majority of genocide scholars, when they say this is genocide, they also think in terms of the legal definition, but also more broadly. For others, I would say, and in certain senses, including myself, we feel less committed to the legal definition and more to broader definitions that we have in mind. And first and foremost, to the reality we're seeing in front of our eyes, which is basically in Gaza, the Gaza society is being destroyed by Israel. I mean, there is no way around it. I think that's clear to anyone who has conscience and clear eyes to see what is going on.
See, that's where Dr. O'Brien kept focusing on the legality and the legal aspect of genocide. So you make a very important point. Could I ask you broadly, what is the criticism in boxing it in the legal terms of genocide, and how it does not work for many countries and many places where genocide actually must be being carried out and not be defined as genocide?
Right. So the legal definition of genocide basically has two components. The most important component is the intent to destroy a group in whole or in part, especially national, ethnic, religious, and racial groups. So there is you need to prove an intent to destroy the group as such. And then there are genocidal acts, killing, creating conditions of life that are aimed to lead to the death of members of the groups, and so on and so forth, several genocidal acts. Now, if we start even with the question of intent, right? First of all, very, very often it's very hard to prove an intent. I mean, intent here means you need to show that in the mind of the decision makers, they want that's their aim, to destroy the group, right? or that's their intent. There might be also other intents, but one of their intents, at least, is to destroy the groups as such, or a substantial part of it. That's very hard to prove. Now, and it should be said, in history, quite often, genocide took place, or what I would define, and many others would define as genocide, namely the destruction of a group or causing a very severe harm to the group as such. Quite often in history, it was done without a clear subjective intent to destroy the group, but rather there was a policy whose foreseeable consequence was the destruction of the group, whether through killing or expulsion or putting them in concentration camps or many different means. But there wasn't necessarily an intent to destroy the group. It was simply the foreseeable consequence of policy. And for many of us, once you have this kind of a destruction of a group, it should be called genocide.
Gaza today is not a war zone. It is a laboratory of cruelty. Famine is not a byproduct, it is a tactic. Children are not dying from stray bullets, but from starvation. Aid trucks are being blocked, water supplies being cut, power grids destroyed. Doctors are operating in darkness with no medicine. This is not collateral damage. This is deliberate. This is policy. This is the slow, suffocating death of a people. Both Dr. O'Brien and Dr. Lederman agree. The Genocide Convention, crafted in the shadow of the Holocaust, is being shredded in real time.
When I said before that, the part of the legal or part of the reason the legal definition is edited is because of the political interest of the states that were involved in its formulation. So intent was, for example, partly one way to distinguish between what the Allies did and what the Nazis did, right? The Allies killed hundreds of thousands of people, right, in the bombings, nuclear bombings of Japan, or in, incinerating entire cities in Germany, and or what Britain did in India, for that matter, right? But not out of an intent to destroy the group. The Nazis obviously did have intent to destroy many different groups. So the emphasis on intent was one way to distinguish between what the Allies did and what the Nazis did. And there are other aspects there. So, for example, the issue of cultural genocide. For Raphael Lemkin, the Jewish Polish jurist who coined the term genocide, for him, the destruction of a group's culture, its cultural institutions, sites, its institutions of education, so on, its use of the language, that was a prominent way of destroying a group. And he wanted this part of cultural destruction to be in the definition, but that was removed partly because different states were worried that they would be accused of genocide. For example, again, what Britain did in India, what the US did to the Native Americans or to the African Americans, what the French did in Algeria, and so on, so forth. So political interests were part of it, and this is one reason. So in other words, it was intentional that the legal definition would be so narrow that very often you would be able to determine genocide only in retrospect. Paradoxically, we have a situation where the legal definition or the convention actually serves to block us from preventing genocide when they actually take place, like in the case, for example, in the case of Israel and Gaza, right? Because on the one hand, we are seeing the destruction of Gaza and Gazan society. On the other hand, there's still a debate whether there is an intent to destroy the group or not, and it's going to be determined by the ICJ, the International Court at The Hague, Court of Justice at The Hague. Only, probably, and it will take them several years. In the meantime, nobody stops Israel, and that's a problem. And it's a problem that is inherent.
Isn't it ironical that the Genocide Convention came about after the Holocaust? Israel's creation in many ways was because of the persecution of the Jews. And today, the very same nation, Israel, is meting out the same kind of treatment to the Palestinians.
Honestly, what we have today is incredibly tragic. And I think that where we have, yes, the Genocide Convention came about in part as a result of the Holocaust. And in fact, the definition of genocide and the Genocide Convention itself was a creation of a Polish Jewish legal expert Raphael Lemkin, who himself lost family in the Holocaust. And I think one of the important things to remember is that the Jewish people have a fear, an existential fear that someone will destroy their people. And the reason that they have that fear is because it happened to them. And it happened to them in the lifetime of people that are still alive today. So this is not something that is completely coming out of nowhere. This is something based on an experience that happened to their people, where there was the destruction of 6 million of their people. And so their fear is grounded in what happened to the Holocaust. And unfortunately, we can never undo the Holocaust. And therefore, we can never take away that fear that exists because of that. I think it's important to remember that. But while we are balancing the fact that, of course, even if Israel had a right to self-defense against an armed attack from a non-state group, in this case Hamas and other potential terrorist groups, that there is certainly no justification for the commission of genocide. And I feel that what we have here is an incredibly tragic situation of a people who are overcome with fear, which is resulting in horrific crimes being committed against another people. And unfortunately, in history, we have seen this too often, where victims become perpetrators, become victims, and so on in cyclical violence over times, even hundreds of years. So it is overall just incredibly tragic circumstances.
The legal definition of genocide demands proof of intent, yet when that intent is broadcast on television and carried out on ground, the legal system still stalls. Why? Because the framework was never built to protect the colonized. It was defined and built by the victors. It exempts the powerful and shields allies. International Court of Justice is hearing a case brought by South Africa, but that process will take years. And even then, no state has been sanctioned, no leader arrested, no arms embargo enforced. Why? Because the United States of America vetoes every attempt. Because the UK and Europe equivocate. Because India and others turn away. The so-called liberal democracies, custodians of human rights, have become accomplices. Time and again, whenever allegations of genocide are brought against Israel, it labels those accusations as being anti-Semitic. Legitimate human rights concerns are drowned in accusations of anti-Semitism. This is a deliberate tactic to silence dissent, to shut down inquiry, and to protect a state from accountability. Dr. Lederman, himself an Israeli Jew, has felt this weaponization firsthand. He says clearly, one can be Jewish and condemn genocide. In fact, it is a moral imperative. Anti-Semitism is real and dangerous, but invoking it to excuse state violence cheapens its meaning and dishonors its victims.
I think we need to distinguish very sharply between criticism, whatever harsh criticism of Israel, and anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is about certain prejudices, stereotypes, generalization, demonization of Jews, right? And what we are seeing here, and on many other occasions in the past, is simply a critique of a sovereign state, right? Israel, which has been doing terrible crimes before the war in Gaza, right? I mean, much before the war in Gaza, we have been conducting deadly military operations in Gaza. Before that, the military occupation of the occupied Palestinian territories is a crime in itself. The settlements are a war crime. So I think it's absolutely possible to criticize Israel very harshly, as one should do, without that having to do even remotely with anti-Semitism.
Have you faced such criticism after your statements on genocide? Have you also faced such criticism?
So me being an Israeli Jew, it's harder to criticize me as anti-Semite, right? So you might find on social media things like that, right? This is he's the auto anti-Semite, right? He hates himself basically, but it's more difficult to take it seriously when it's an Israeli Jew. There is a certain privilege in the sense of what kind of accusations can be mounted against you when you are an Israeli Jew. So I never took it seriously, this kind of accusations, and so far it has not been very common to call me that. But of course, I'm very aware of the way, anyone who kind of crosses a certain line is being accused of being an anti-Semite. And that's, I mean, sometimes it's true, right? Anti-Semitism is a real problem, right? But very often, more often than not, it's simply, a way of silencing people, in my view, to call them anti-Semite because they criticize Israel rather in what some perceive as too harshly.
This is not just Israel's crime, it is a global betrayal. America supplies the bombs, Europe provides cover, India abstains from even calling for a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip, and the United Nations, shackled by vetoes and geopolitics, stands paralyzed. The same countries that invoke rules-based international order now bankroll its destruction. They condemned Russia for Ukraine. They sanctioned Syria. They mourned Rwanda, Bosnia, Darfur. But in Gaza, they offer excuses. This is the end of the moral order. When genocide becomes negotiable, dependent on politics, alliances, and identity, then no one is safe. Not Palestinians, not Rohingya, not Uyghurs, not Jews, not anyone. Dr. O'Brien and Dr. Lederman say it plainly. Civil society now is the front line, not the diplomats, not generals, not presidents, you. Association aside, Melanie, what is it that you think in terms of the failure of the international community to stop Israel from carrying out what you also have called genocide?
It's a really challenging time to work in international law because we have the laws. They are there and they exist, but unfortunately they are not always complied with. So many times they are, and I'm certainly still a very strong advocate for the international legal system that we have, but what we need to see is the implementation of that system. And it has been slow in this case, and it has also been piecemeal, where we have seen different actions taken by different states, such as, for example, the implementation of sanctions against Israeli leaders by different countries at different times. There were recent sanctions brought, for example, by a group of countries, including Australia, Norway, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom and Canada. But previously we've seen sanctions brought by European countries, for example. So these are quite slow. But what those countries all need to remember is, and they are all parties to the Genocide Convention, is that they do have obligations to act. So these sanctions are important, but likewise, so is action on a domestic level in considering what is their relationship with Israel, particularly when it comes to providing any form of military assistance, whether that be selling weapons or military equipment or training. Any of that needs to be ceased immediately and should have already stopped because of those obligations in terms of preventing genocide, and also not wanting to be held accountable even for possibly contributing to the genocide that is happening on the ground. It is also really frustrating, I will freely admit, that the Security Council system, obviously with the veto power of the permanent 5 members, that includes the United States, that will, of course, essentially veto any action that the Security Council could take with regards to this. And that is a source of frustration to international scholars who essentially, have really concluded that there is no chance of Security Council reform because of the way the system is set up. But it prevents, this main international body that's tasked with peace and security from acting on the ground with this particular situation that's going on. And the same obviously applies when we're talking about Ukraine, Russia, with Russia's veto as well. So there are plenty of frustrations, but I do ask that people retain their trust and hope in international law. We have cases going forward at the moment in the International Court of Justice. South Africa has brought a case against Israel. Nicaragua has brought a case against Germany regarding its supply of military equipment to Israel and support for Israel. We also have arrest warrants that the International Criminal Court has issued against Benjamin Netanyahu and the former defense minister of Israel, Yoav Gallant. So those arrest warrants are sitting there waiting for state parties of the International Criminal Court to implement those, to arrest those people and surrender them to the court. So there are still mechanisms that are functioning.
Are you disappointed in the international community, world leaders, and the ineffectiveness of the United Nations Security Council?
I mean, yes, absolutely. And at the same time, it's not surprising, right? I mean, we have, again, as the genocide scholars, we have known for a long time that at least when it comes to important allies of members of the Security Council, and especially the US, you're going to see immunity and support for the crimes that those allies are committing. And it might be Saudi Arabia in what it did in Yemen, and it might be Israel in what it has been doing to Palestinians, right? So on the one hand, yes, of course it's disappointing, and I should be honest. One of the mistakes I made in my analysis of the war is that I thought that at some point President Biden would simply stop Israel because you can't support that the kind of atrocity Israel was committing. And it turned out that no, Biden simply kept supporting Israel and allowed it to do what it did. And of course, without U.S. support, without American support, Israel could not have done what it did. So yeah, absolutely there is a disappointment. But at the same time, we need to recognize the international system has been broken in that sense for a long time. I mean, once you have important allies of the great powers, they have been allowed to commit terrible crimes. And that's, we see the same situation here, only it's much more clear to so many people around the world who pay attention to what is going on.
Genocide isn't just the act of killing. It's the silence that surrounds it. It's the UN resolution that never passes. The news anchor who says conflict instead of massacre. The leader who says both sides while one side starves. You don't have to be a Palestinian to care. You just have to be human. What is happening in Gaza is not complicated. It is clear. It is genocide, and the world knows it. The question is, will the world stop it? Or will we once again offer history our regrets, written in the blood of the silenced?